You were never supposed to hear this. What you're about to discover was sealed away, buried in state archives, whispered only in broken memories by the few men who survived the encounter. But once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Imagine the deepest forest you've ever known, trees older than nations, shadows thicker than walls, and a boy alone, waiting for someone to stumble across the edge of his nightmare. This is not folklore. This is not a story told around a campfire. This is an incident recorded, classified, and buried under orders that still stand today. September 23, 1851, Adirondack Wilderness. 3 men follow the smoke of a dying fire into a valley no map has ever named. What they find there will strip them of sleep for the rest of their lives. Picture the cabin before you: raw timbers, stitched hides, symbols carved into the bark like wounds on the forest itself. The smell hits first. Carrion and ash mixed with something human and sour. Bones dangle from branches, a warning or an invitation. The trees themselves seem to lean closer, as if listening. And then, from inside, a voice. Not English, not French, not any tongue spoken by man. A child's voice, high and quick, bursting with clicks and guttural sounds, rhythms like an animal's heartbeat crossed with a code. This was Benjamin Harwick, 12 years old, a boy raised in a hidden experiment to purge human language of its supposed corruption, to speak only the true words of existence. But there is something else the records do not say directly. Every man who stepped into that cabin described the same feeling: not fear, not even revulsion, but the unmistakable sense of being watched from inside their own skulls. As if the walls themselves were alive, as if the carvings were speaking in ways they couldn't consciously hear. They would later describe it as an atmosphere of malevolent intelligence, a place not built but grown. And the boy, he wasn't begging to be saved. He was trying to warn them, or command them. He gestured, chanted, and marked the floor with his hands, as though opening something older than language itself. The men should have turned back the moment they heard him. Every hunter knows the instinct that rises when the woods go wrong, when a silence isn't just absence but intent. Yet they pushed forward, drawn by a force they couldn't name. Later, Dr. Schuyler would confess he felt something, like a current pulling at his chest, not a physical drag but a subtle command to step closer. When they crossed the threshold of the cabin, the world itself seemed to tighten. Shadows stretched unnaturally, the smell of burnt fat and iron filled their throats. This was not a home. This was a chamber built to transform human consciousness. Benjamin Harwick sat in the center, like an anchor between two realities. His eyes tracked each of them in sequence, not with a child's curiosity, but with a predator's patience. His skin bore raised scars, deliberate patterns cut into flesh, each echoing the symbols carved into the walls. The journals they found, bound in cracked leather and brittle twine, revealed what Ezra Harwick had been attempting: a systematic destruction of civilized thought through the construction of a new language, untainted by centuries of deception. In his writings, he called it the Restoration, a process he believed would awaken dormant capacities hidden in the human mind. The boy's language wasn't gibberish. It was a lattice, a weaponized pattern of sound designed to bypass conscious filters. When he spoke, Schuyler later wrote, it was like being addressed by the marrow of my own bones. The rhythms struck directly at the nervous system. His gestures were not random either. They formed geometries with his fingers, small mudras that seemed to resonate with the carvings around them. Brennan noticed first that the fire in the hearth burned without wood. The embers were black stones carved with the same glyphs that covered the ceiling. The flames were a pale green, flickering in sync with Benjamin's voice. It was as though he was feeding it with vibration alone. And then the boy paused, tilted his head, and in a voice that cracked but was still alien, spoke one English word: stay, not a plea, an instruction. The 3 men froze as if their muscles had been wired to his command. The moment that single English word left his mouth, time inside the cabin seemed to fold. Schuyler later described it as a compression of reality, the sense that the space between walls and ceiling had closed in without moving. Brennan's hand went instinctively to his rifle, but found no strength in his fingers. It was as if the weapon itself had become irrelevant. The boy was no longer merely speaking. He was conducting. His hands moved through the air, tracing angles and spirals, and the symbols carved into the wood began to shimmer with a damp, oily sheen. This was the first sign that language, in this place, was not just sound but architecture, a scaffolding for something older than human history. One journal entry, later translated from Ezra Harwick's spidery script, revealed the father's obsession. He believed spoken words were prisons for perception, and that true language could unlock pre-Adamic cognition, a state of mind preceding morality, hierarchy, and deceit. In this state, man would no longer be bound by the social fabric, but would operate as pure will. He wrote of phase patterns and auditory keys, claiming that repeated exposure would rewire a child's nervous system and awaken ancestral faculties dormant since the tower. The boy's eyes gleamed with a dull, animal light as he rose to his feet. His bones seemed too long for his frame, as though he had grown faster than his body could adjust. He moved with a stiff grace, neither stumbling nor hesitating, and the symbols on his skin seemed to throb with each breath. Then came the sound, not a word, but a low, layered hum like a swarm of insects resonating inside their skulls. The hunter's teeth ached, their vision blurred at the edges. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing the ground itself is pulling you forward. On the cabin floor, beneath a pile of furs, lay a white circle of carved bone fragments arranged into a precise mandala. Benjamin stepped into its center and looked directly at Schuyler. The hum cut off. Silence swallowed the room so dense it felt physical. Then, in a calm but guttural rhythm, the boy began again, weaving sound that was not meant to be heard by ordinary men. Schuyler felt it first, a splitting behind the eyes, as if a door had opened somewhere inside his skull. Brennan staggered against the wall, gripping one of the carved beams for balance, his knuckles whitening as splinters bit into his skin. The boy's sound wasn't just in the air anymore. It was inside them, vibrating their bones, pulling at the invisible scaffolding of thought itself. Later, Schuyler would write that it felt like being spoken to from within, as if my own memories were a foreign language being translated without my consent. Benjamin's gestures became sharper, almost ritualistic, and the patterns on the cabin walls flickered with a faint phosphorescence. What the men couldn't yet know was that Ezra Harwick had prepared the entire environment as a resonance chamber. The carvings, the stones, the scars on the boy's flesh, all forming a living circuit for a language designed not to inform, but to transform. He believed he could sculpt consciousness the way a mason sculpts stone, and his own son was the chisel. One journal entry described the final stage of the experiment. At last the boy speaks not words but vectors. Each tone a command, each syllable a geometry. Ezra wrote that this new speech would erase the distortions of society and open the hidden faculty of command, a mental dominion over others so complete they would obey before realizing they'd been instructed. Culver tried to speak, to assert his authority as constable, but the words caught in his throat and died there. His tongue felt foreign in his mouth. Brennan's eyes rolled back briefly as his grip on the rifle loosened. All three men were now inside the perimeter of something older than religion, older than civilization. Benjamin's gaze swept over them like a spotlight. He pointed to the mandala of bone at his feet, then to each man in turn, making a subtle gesture like a hook, pulling something invisible from their chests. The hunters later reported, feeling a sudden drop in temperature, as if the cabin had inhaled. Schuyler's medical training screamed at him to move, to act, to disrupt the pattern. But another part of him wanted to kneel, to listen, to let it happen. What happened next slipped beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. Later, when questioned by state officials, each man's description diverged in detail, but aligned in one terrible core truth. Something in that cabin tried to overwrite them. It began with their senses. The rough wood of the floor smoothed into cold stone. The flicker of firelight elongated into lines of green light, running up the walls like veins. They felt not heat but vibration, a slow rolling tremor passing up through their boots into their bones. The boy's chant shifted from guttural bursts to a low, cycling tone, as if he were tuning an instrument too vast for the human ear. Schuyler's journal, confiscated but later leaked, claims Benjamin was no longer speaking to them at all, but through them, using their nervous systems as conduits. I felt words forming in my blood, he wrote. Not sentences, but imperatives. Brennan tried to flee, but found himself stepping forward instead, his body answering some command his conscious mind rejected. Culver's hands lifted of their own accord, palms open, as if offering something unseen. The mandala of bones pulsed with a faint light now, like coals buried under ash. Its geometry was perfect arcs and intersecting lines forming a wheel with 4 outer nodes. Within each node, small carvings that might have been human faces, or masks. As Benjamin moved, the wheel seemed to rotate without touching the floor, its bone fragments held in place by something like magnetic force. Ezra's writings hinted at this phase. When the wheel turns, the veil thins. The subject speaks the language that predates mankind, and thereby inherits the faculty of command. To Ezra, this was a holy evolution. To the 3 intruders, it felt like trespassing into a ritual meant for no witness. The boy's eyes rolled white, his mouth opened unnaturally wide, and the tone he produced dropped so low it rattled the cabin's structure. In that instant, each man saw, or thought he saw, a flicker of something standing behind the boy, tall, jointed wrong, its outline pulsing with the same glyphs etched into the walls. The impression lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. They knew this was no longer just a child. The air inside the cabin thickened until it felt like breathing through cloth soaked in oil. Schuyler's vision shimmered. Brennan's knees buckled. Even Culver, who had always prided himself on cold control, felt his will unspooling like loose thread. Benjamin no longer looked at them as individuals. His gaze had become fixed and unfocused, as though he were reading a hidden text projected behind their eyes. The strange flicker they'd glimpsed a moment before now pressed at the edge of perception, a tall silhouette crowding the cabin without space to exist. It was as if the boy had opened a doorway by speaking, crack through which something older than the forest was leaning. Schuyler tried to anchor himself by reciting a medical formula in his head, but the words dissolved into static. Brennan whispered a prayer, only to hear it emerge in the boy's alien tongue, his own lips forming sounds he did not choose. The cabin itself had become a feedback chamber. Every thought they resisted seemed to bounce back amplified, turned against them. This was Ezra's ultimate thesis, that normal language builds walls in the mind, but this other language could reach directly into the nervous system and reshape it, bypassing consent. The restoration, he had called it, the unmasking of will. He believed he could use it to forge a new kind of man. Benjamin's arms rose slowly, palms outward, fingers crooked into the same geometry carved on his skin. The wheel of bone at his feet spun faster, though no hand touched it. A smell of metal and earth filled the cabin, mixed with something sweet and rotting. Schuyler felt a heat behind his eyes, as though his own memories were being rifled through. In that moment, Benjamin spoke again, but this time, the words vibrated in English and something else at once. Identity unbound. The hunters froze. They felt a vertigo deeper than any mountain ledge, a sense that their very selves were being pried open. If you are still here, Still listening. Right, the wheel turns. Twice in the comments right now. Let it be the symbol that locks this knowledge into you, a sign that you are not merely watching but crossing over. Something cracked inside each man at the same instant. Not a sound in the room but a sensation in the skull, like an eggshell giving way. For a heartbeat they no longer knew who they were. Names, memories, even the concept of self blurred. They stood inside the cabin, but also somewhere vast and lightless, as though Benjamin's chant had folded the forest into a hidden chamber beneath reality. Their bodies were rigid, their thoughts streamed past like strangers. Skylar glimpsed flashes that were not his own, a dark coastline under a sky of 2 moons, figures moving in silent procession carrying spiked symbols. Brennan saw his dead father's face, mouth moving but producing only the alien clicks of Benjamin's speech. Culver felt his own childhood dissolve into a lattice of sound and geometry. Each vision was different, yet bound by a single message: you are not what you think you are. Benjamin's mouth moved but no sound emerged now. Instead the glyphs on his skin pulsed, emitting thin beams of greenish light that threaded through the air and touched each man on the forehead. Skylar felt a pressure like a thumbprint at the center of his brow. Brennan tried to scream but found the act impossible. Culver's heartbeat slowed to a crawl. One journal page, later deciphered by archivists, predicted this exact moment. Ezra had written, "When the vessel radiates without sound, the observers will be mapped." Their internal architectures revealed, their unchosen selves awakened. He believed this exposure would break the false ego and produce men of pure will, empty of delusion. But to the 3 intruders, it felt like violation, not revelation. The beams of light drew filaments from their heads. Not physical matter but impressions, memories, fears, pulling them like threads into the spinning wheel of bone. Each thread was absorbed and the wheel's glow deepened from pale green to a wet crimson. Benjamin's eyes rolled back, and for the first time since they'd entered the cabin, a sound escaped him. A single exhalation that was both sigh and growl. The beams snapped away. The men collapsed to their knees, gasping, their own thoughts echoing back at them in the alien tongue, unable to tell if they were still themselves at all. The cabin seemed to breathe around them now, its walls flexing with each flicker of firelight. The carvings, once static, moved in slow undulations as if alive. Each man realized with a creeping horror that the symbols weren't just etched. They were growing. New lines were appearing across the wood in real time, curling outward like frost, branching toward the floor where the wheel of bone spun in silence. The boy stood perfectly still, eyes closed, but the power in the room no longer emanated from his body. It came from everywhere at once. Skylar forced his hand to his satchel and drew out a small scalpel, his last tether to the rational world. He pressed its edge against his palm, hoping pain would anchor him. But when the blade cut flesh, the blood that welled up shimmered faintly green. Brennan tried to pray again, but the name of God dissolved on his tongue, replaced by a click and a guttural hiss. Culver, trembling, found himself mouthing words he didn't know, tracing shapes in the air with his fingers, as though the cabin itself were using his body to complete its pattern. Ezra's journals had warned of this stage. When the vessel stabilizes, the environment itself will mirror the new language, becoming a membrane through which the older world can be rewritten. This was the point at which the experiment ceased to be a theory and became a territory. The boy's eyes snapped open, no pupils, just black, lightless orbs. He raised both arms high, and the spinning wheel stopped dead. The silence that followed was so dense it compressed their ears, a vacuum swallowing every noise, even their breath. Then came a low tremor in the ground, rolling through the floorboards like a heartbeat rising from the earth. For an instant each man felt the outlines of something enormous beneath the cabin, like an immense hand pressing upward. They understood, without words, that Ezra had not built this place above empty soil. He had built it over something he believed he could awaken. Benjamin inhaled sharply and whispered a single word. Not English, not any human tongue. The carvings ignited at once, spilling light so bright it erased the room. When the light slammed outward, it wasn't illumination in the normal sense. It was structure, lattices of green, white beams slicing the darkness into grids. The three men found themselves suspended inside it like insects in amber, every nerve ending exposed to a geometry they could not comprehend. The cabin no longer existed as wood and stone, but as a blueprint of vibrating lines. Even the boy appeared as a pulsing node at the center of a massive pattern that stretched far beyond the walls. Skylar's body shook as involuntary tears streamed down his face. Brennan's jaw hung slack, eyes darting as he whispered fragments of scripture, but the words came out scrambled, inverted, reversed. Culver fought the urge to let go completely, clutching at a phantom badge pinned to his coat, as if it could still mean authority here. Each man sensed that the grid around them wasn't a display, but a language, the physical embodiment of what Benjamin had been taught to speak. Ezra's journals had called this stage the aperture. He believed that once opened, it would reveal the source beneath all human cognition, the unmediated current of power. In practical terms, it meant the experiment was no longer reversible. Once the aperture formed, the participants would either ascend into the new state or be erased as unstable constructs. Benjamin floated a few inches above the wheel of bone now, his limbs slack, head tilted back. Thin filaments of light streamed from his mouth, weaving themselves into the greater lattice. The symbols carved into his skin glowed like molten metal. In the silence, a new sound emerged, a deep, oceanic roar that seemed to come from under the earth, growing louder until it was felt more than heard. For the first time, Skylar sensed a choice. Not freedom, but a forked step inward, become part of the pattern, or resist and be crushed. Brennan's lips bled where he bit them, trying to anchor himself. Culver closed his eyes and muttered his children's names, each syllable a desperate lifeline. The lattice pulsed. The wheels spun once more, slower now, each rotation like a tolling bell. Benjamin opened his eyes, black as the space between stars, and the roar deepened to a wordless command. The roar condensed into a single, seismic pulse. It was not a sound but a pressure, a thudding push that rolled through their skulls like an ocean collapsing inward. Skylar's vision inverted. Dark became light, up became down, and for a moment he thought his body had been turned inside out. Brennan vomited without bending, the liquid vanishing before it hit the floor, absorbed by the shimmering lattice. Culver's heart pounded so slowly he could hear each beat echo like a drum in an empty cathedral. Benjamin drifted higher, his arms spread, palms forward. The wheel of bone beneath him disassembled mid-air, fragments spinning around him like an orbit of pale moons. The green, white lattice now resembled an enormous mouth opening around them, rows of glyphs like teeth. In the journals, Ezra had written of this exact vision. When the mouth opens, the old world ends inside the witness before it ends outside. For the first time since the ordeal began, the boy spoke English again, but not as a plea. Each word landed like a hammer in their chests. You carry false names. You stand in false time. I will strip you. His voice was both child and something immense. The lattice flared, and each man's memories surfaced violently. Births, betrayals, secret shames, all projected into the air as flickering shapes. Skylar saw his own childhood bedroom dissolving into symbols. Brennan watched his dead brother step out of the grid, face blank, then vanish. Culver clutched his temples, screaming silently as his badge, his oath, his sense of law and order disintegrated into glowing dust. Ezra's writings had promised a new man, immune to the lies of society. But what stood in the cabin now felt like annihilation masquerading as rebirth. The choice they sensed earlier was collapsing into inevitability. Benjamin's eyes snapped from one man to the next. He raised a single finger and drew a slow vertical line in the air. Wherever he moved it, the lattice peeled apart, revealing a depthless black behind it, a void that felt like a mouth of infinite size. The roar became a heartbeat. The heartbeat became silence, and then, without warning, the boy whispered, "Step through." The black seam Benjamin opened wasn't a doorway in any normal sense. It was absence, a cut in the fabric of perception. No frame, no threshold, just a vertical wound in reality bleeding silence. Every instinct screamed at the three men to stay back, but that same invisible pressure that had drawn them to the cabin now tugged at their chests with unbearable force. Their thoughts fluttered like birds trapped in a cage. The boy's voice, soft but absolute, drifted over them. "Step through." It was not a request. It was the continuation of a pattern already begun. Skylar's knuckles went white as he dug his nails into his palms, blood running down his wrists. He tried to think of the outside world, of the hospital where he'd trained, of his wife's face. But each memory dissolved into glyphs. Brennan's eyes filled with tears. He had once killed a bear with nothing but a spear. Now he couldn't even move his feet. Culver, jaw trembling, whispered his own name out loud just to hear it one last time. Ezra's final journal entry hinted at this culminations. The membrane opens. One step and all constructs fall away. No priest, no law, no lie can follow beyond the cut. Ezra believed this was salvation. To Skylar, Brennan, and Culver it felt like execution disguised as revelation. Benjamin tilted his head. The black seam widened, spilling no light, but pulling air inward with a soundless suction. The walls of the cabin bowed toward it, carvings stretching like wet paint. The boy extended his hand toward Skylar first, palm outward, fingers trembling. For a heartbeat Skylar saw not a child but Ezra himself standing there, eyes wild with triumph. The suction grew stronger, pulling at their coats, their hair, even their thoughts. Brennan's rifle rose off the floor and vanished into the seam without a sound. Culver staggered forward, boots scraping the boards, caught between will and command. In that moment Skylar felt a flicker of clarity. This was not about language or purity but power. The power to unmake and remake. Benjamin lowered his hand, eyes black as night, and whispered one last phrase in the alien tongue. The seam pulsed. The choice was over. The seam swallowed the last of the cabin's light as if it were drinking reality itself. Boards curled upward, nails dissolving like salt, the stove collapsing into an outline of sparks. Benjamin remained at the center, hovering inches above the shrinking wheel of bone. The three men were dragged forward inch by inch, their boots scraping against a floor that was no longer wood but a slick, pulsing membrane. The air pressed around them like deep water. Skylar heard his own voice shouting inside his skull. But it wasn't his mouth moving. Brennan clutched his chest, feeling his heartbeat throb in the palm of an invisible hand. Culver reached for his badge out of reflex, only to find his fingers grasping empty air, the emblem already stripped away. Above them, the carvings rippled, and then peeled off the walls entirely, swirling into the seam like a spiral of black paper. Ezra had scrawled a final warning in the margins of his last notebook, a line almost no one noticed. The membrane will offer a mirror first. As the three men neared the threshold, each saw a different reflection standing inside the void. Skylar glimpsed himself as a child, blank-eyed and still. Brennan saw a version of himself in uniform, medals gleaming but mouth sewn shut. Culver saw nothing at all, only an outline of static in the shape of a man. Benjamin's arms dropped to his sides. His black eyes flickered once with a faint trace of green, as if some part of him still remembered being a boy. He exhaled, and the suction doubled. Skylar stumbled forward. Brennan's boots lifted clear off the floor. Culver's hands clawed at empty air. Then came a flash of soundless impact, like thunder in vacuum. The seam did not widen but clenched, swallowing everything it had pulled. For a heartbeat, the world went perfectly still. The boy, the men, the wheel, the cabin, all of it hung in suspension. When the darkness collapsed, only the forest remained, silent and undisturbed, as though the cabin had never existed. The clearing smelled faintly of ozone and iron. A single circle of ash lay where the door had been, its pattern faintly resembling a wheel. By dawn, the clearing was nothing but frost and silence. Where the cabin had stood, there was now only a blackened depression, ringed by pines bent inward, as though bowing to some invisible weight. Hikers later reported the ground felt charged, like standing near a storm before it breaks. Animals avoided the spot entirely. No birdsong, no insects, only a faint metallic tang on the air. When investigators arrived 2 weeks later, they found almost nothing: no nails, no wood fragments, no tools, no footprints leading away. Only the circle of ash at the center, its lines faintly curved into a wheel. Soil samples came back with anomalous readings. High iron content, trace amounts of an unidentified crystalline structure, and a low but measurable electromagnetic field, persisting for days after removal from the site. Yet there were witnesses, or at least echoes. A trucker who had driven the mountain road that night swore he saw a flash of green light pulsing upward through the trees. A woman at a nearby lodge reported hearing a low horn rolling over the hills around midnight. Even stranger were the notebooks that surfaced online months later, scans of pages allegedly torn from Ezra's journals. On one page, in his cramped script, he had written, 3 went in, 1 became map, 2 became shadow. The vessel emptied. Rumors bloomed: cult activity, military experiment, mass hallucination. Some blamed contaminated groundwater, others secret infrasound tests, but none of the explanations accounted for the missing men. Skylar, Brennan, and Culver were never found. Their families received sealed boxes from state authorities containing only clothing and personal effects recovered from storage lockers. Locals began to treat the area as cursed. Hunters nailed charms to nearby trees. Children dared one another to step into the circle at dusk, but even the bravest refused to linger past nightfall. The wheel shape in the ash slowly faded under rain and wind, but it left a faint depression, as if the earth itself had settled into a new alignment. And yet, sometimes at the edge of that clearing, a soundless pulse ripples through the pines, a tremor felt only in the sternum. Those who have felt it say it's not a noise but a word, arriving without language, telling them simply step through. Decades later, the ash wheel became less a mystery than a folk compass, a fixed point in the county's dark mythology. Newspapers called it the vanishing cabin of Ezra, though no official map ever listed a structure at that location. Forest rangers posted a wooden sign: no camping, sensitive habitat. But that only drew more visitors. Paranormal forums blossomed with speculation, theories of interdimensional portals, Cold War weapons tests, and an elaborate hoax engineered by the missing men themselves. Yet the soil sample data, released under a Freedom of Information request, showed patterns too precise for accident and too alien for hoax. An anthropology graduate student in 1997 collected oral histories from the older loggers and hunters. Most had never gone near the place but spoke of a hum under the ribs when the wind blew from the north. One man recalled waking at 3 a.m. to see pale arcs flicker between the trees like ribs of lightning, only to find his watch had stopped at that moment and never worked again. These accounts echoed details from Ezra's notes: tremors, geometry, and the sense of being called. By the early 2000s, the clearing had grown dense with new pines, but a perfect circle at its center still resisted growth. A patch of soil bare even in spring. Amateur researchers who camped nearby reported identical dreams of a child's voice saying, "Identity unbound," and "step through." One claimed he woke to find faint glyphs pressed into his skin like bruises, which faded by morning. Official interest never fully disappeared. Military helicopters occasionally swept low over the area. Geologists set up temporary stations but refused interviews. The county sealed property records, citing archival damage. Today, the ash wheel is a whispered dare among teenagers and an obsession for a small cadre of independent researchers. The legend has grown into something more than the sum of its parts, a story about will, language, and a boy whose chant unstitched a corner of the world. Whether you believe any of it or not, the clearing remains. People still walk to its edge, feel the tremor in their bones, and swear that for a moment they see a vertical seam in the air, a cut in reality waiting to be opened. In the winter of 2017, a snowmobile rescue crew responding to a lost hiker stumbled across the circle by accident. GPS logs later showed their route curving, without conscious steering, directly toward the coordinates of the old Harwick clearing. They reported the forest unnaturally silent under the snow. No birds, no wind, even the usual cracking of frozen branches muted. When they reached the bare patch at the center, their compasses spun. One crew member's body camera recorded a full 3 minutes of distorted audio, a high-pitched rhythm of clicks and guttural syllables that linguists who analyzed the file said bore statistical resemblance to no known tongue, but shared the same phonetic clusters, documented from Benjamin Harwick in 1851. When the team tried to leave, their GPS units mapped them in concentric loops, even though they believed they were moving in a straight line. One member reported a sensation, like a thin membrane pressing against my face. Another claimed he heard a child whispering the phrase, "The door remains," over and over, directly behind him, though no one else was there. Panic set in. Only after one of them fired a flare gun into the air did the forest's soundscape return, and their electronics stabilize, allowing them to navigate out. The incident reached local news for one day before disappearing from digital archives. Links broken, videos deleted, reporters unreachable. But fragments survived in private backups, passed around in hidden forums. Linguistic analysis of the recovered audio revealed a chilling pattern. Every seventh word matched one of Ezra Harwick's. Forbidden glyphs from the journals, as if the clearing itself still spoke through anyone who entered. This final documented encounter turned the legend into something else entirely. It was no longer just about a boy speaking an impossible language, but about a living system. Language as a gate, geometry as a trigger, consciousness as a key. Researchers who've heard the audio describe a lingering pull, like a low-frequency vibration that continues in their skulls long after playback stops. Some report dreams of standing in a forest lit from below, a vertical seam glowing white ahead of them, a child's silhouette at its threshold. That is where the record ends. At least the record you're allowed to see. There are other files, but they are sealed in places you will never be invited to enter. Or perhaps you already have, by hearing this. The door remains.